So last week we started a new series called Lost and Found. And there are all sorts of reasons why we lose things. Sometimes we're careless, sometimes we're distracted, but there's another reason why things might get lost and then stay lost. Some things stay lost for a long time, collecting dust because frankly, no one's looking for them. Some things aren't always worth looking for. Like if you think about it, we only really search for things that are really valuable to us. I've never seen anyone, search high and low for a misplaced paperclip or a penny, right? Like in our minds, that's not worth all the effort. We're like, it's a paperclip. Like there are so many paperclips out there, right? It's just not worth your time because it's not worth very much. But have you ever traveled out of the country and misplaced your passport? I don't know that I've ever seen anyone search with more, desire to find something than someone who thinks that they have no way home, right? Or maybe you've searched for your lost keys or your phone. Like the few times I've lost my phone, I'm like, literally everything I need in life is on that phone, right? So you look for them because you know they have value. Now, when we talk about whether or not something is valuable, sometimes that's a matter of opinion. Let me give you an example. My dad is a craftsman. Recently, he found a whole truckload of high quality lumber. Now, this is from some tree that is difficult to get lumber from. And so he is so excited about this lumber. And he's talking to all of his friends about it. And he's thinking about all the beautiful stuff he can make with it. And he's telling me multiple times about this high quality wood or whatever that he found. But for me, I have no idea what to do with lumber. That's not my thing, right? And so while my dad might have this appreciation for different types of, materials, and he can recognize oh, that's, white pine, and that's walnut, and that's cherry. You can just look at it and tell. To me, it just all looks like boards. It doesn't hold the same value for me. So whether or not something is valuable is often a matter of opinion and the person's perspective. You and I can see the same item, but whether or not it has value to us is determined by our perspective, similar to my dad and that whole truckload of lumber. To him, that's very valuable. To me, I'm it's another board, right? I don't know if you can relate to this, but I have had moments and seasons of my life where I wondered how much I actually matter, whether or not I actually had value to others and God. From their perspective, do they deem me as valuable? And I've also treated other people in my life as if they were beneath me. That's something that I'm not proud of, something I regret. I've treated them as if they weren't worth my time and attention, and I treated them as if they did hold less value than other people did. And so often, this is the way that we live. We live in a world where we feel like we are competing or trying to climb some imaginary ladder so that we can feel like we have value. And as part of our culture, we tend to assign value to ourselves and others based on certain things that are really just a part of our culture. Things like possessions, as if our money or our stuff could actually add or subtract value to us. Now, when I say that, we're like, that's so silly. But how often do we really think that if we just have a particular thing, a particular product, or a particular kind of house or vacation, that we have more value as a human being, right? So we might laugh that off, but we know that that's so much of the way that we tend to think about other people. Or oftentimes we do the same thing with our abilities. We tend to think that if a person has a lot of athletic or artistic ability, or if they do super well in school, that they as a human being have more value. And then we look around at others or maybe ourselves, and if we don't see that same athletic or artistic or academic ability, then we think, well, then I guess those people or myself, that I have less value as a person. Or sometimes we think about it as other characteristics like attractiveness or popularity or sense of humor. And we tend to think that if a person has those, that they are of higher value. And that if they don't, then we tend to diminish their value or our own value. And that can easily lead you to feel shame about things that you really can't control. Sometimes we start telling ourselves that we don't measure up and that we don't have value, that we're not worth looking for, that we're like the paperclip out there because we don't feel like we have those exceptional traits. And we also tend to distance ourselves from other people that don't fit our definition of what we find to be valuable. And that's different for all of us. But all of us in our mind, as part of our culture, we've adopted an idea of what we deem to be valuable, and then we try to distance ourselves from those we think don't have as much value. But have you ever thought about maybe those metrics of what holds value, maybe those metrics are off? And how many people you've missed out on knowing and connecting with because you deemed them as not having the kind of value that you appreciate based on the metrics that you've adopted. We usually calculate value, ours and others, without really thinking about it. These things seem like they're just sort of ingrained within us. We all have preferences and biases and experiences that have shaped our opinions and what we think is valuable. That's why we have to think critically about what we value and how we define what has value. Because how we think about those things, pausing to think about, well, how have I decided what has value? Who has value? Thinking about that critically is really important because those things that seem like they're on autopilot in us, that's determining how we treat others and how we treat ourselves. And so it's worth taking a moment to say, what are my metrics for how I've determined worth within myself and within others? So that's what we're talking about today. Now, throughout this series, Lost and Found, we're looking at just one chapter from the Bible, Luke 15. And in this chapter, Jesus recounts a bunch of stories. Now, these are not historical stories. These are parables. And parables are stories that Jesus made up and told in order to teach an important truth about life. And so all of these stories in Luke 15 are about things that were once lost and then found. And so we explored the first of these stories last week. But in order for the next story to make sense, we need to remember who Jesus is talking to as he's telling these parables and why he's telling these stories. So let's recap that. So Jesus is talking to these Pharisees, and Pharisees are religious leaders who are super focused on following hundreds of religious laws in order to please God. Now, these laws were important and they're not inherently bad. That's important. And you want to keep in mind that the Pharisees think that they are doing a good thing by being so focused on these laws. And the laws were in fact given by God to help God's people stay healthy and safe and close to God. But what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees is that they've gotten things wrong. They've lost perspective, right? Because the Pharisees believed that following these religious laws exactly could make someone good and holy and therefore elevate their value to God. Over time, though, these Pharisees, they became arrogant and self-righteous and dismissive of people that they believed to be sinful. So the Pharisees often attacked Jesus because he was spending time with people that the Pharisees deemed to be of lower value because they said that they were sinful people. They were angry for the way that Jesus cared for people that they considered to be sinners. Jesus told this series of stories to help the Pharisees see how wrong they were about themselves, others, and God. In other words, like us, sometimes their metrics for determining value were off. Listen to the parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 15, verses 8 through 10. It goes like this. He says, "Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And then when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin.' In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." The woman in the story has 10 coins and she lost one. Now you might be thinking, so what? She's got like 9 other coins. Like, it's just a coin, right? Like, what's the big deal? For this woman, though, you need to put this in perspective. That coin is worth an entire day's wages. That's a full day's work. So I want you to consider if you'd worked all day and gotten paid, and then all of that money is just gone. The loss of this coin would have had a huge impact for her. That explains what happened after she lost her coin and then she finds it. She celebrates. Oh yes, I found this. And this is really important to pay attention to, because what Jesus is teaching us is that there is a huge party in God's heart anytime someone lost gets found by God. Here's why this is so important, because it reminds us that God first looks for us. He pursues us because he knows our value. If we've been wandering away from following Jesus, we tend to tell ourselves that God is just rolling his eyes and incredibly disappointed in us. And then even if we were to say, you know what, I want to follow Jesus, I want to live my life and be about love, and I want to honor God with my life, and I want to follow him, even if I were to turn around and do that, that God would probably be like, about time. That's the way we tend to think about God. But God is looking for us the whole time that we wander. And when we're found, it's not shame, and it's not a lecture, and it's not an eye roll. What Jesus reminds us of here is that it is rejoicing and celebration every time. In this parable, we learn that when we are lost and wandering far from God, God values us enough to tear the whole house apart looking for us, that he is pursuing us. It's great to know that God values you. But also, another key takeaway of this parable wasn't just to tell the Pharisees how much God valued them, because he did. But it was also to remind them that God values everyone. Even the people that were overlooked, dismissed, and judged because the Pharisees didn't think they were holy enough. Because the Pharisees were judgmental towards people that they considered sinners, people who didn't meet their metrics of what carries value. Jesus needed them to understand that God deeply loved the people that didn't matter to them, and that God would look for them too. The Pharisees were convinced these sinners were less valuable to God, and therefore that it was okay to look down on them, because they weren't as pure or as righteous as the Pharisees were. Although the Pharisees knew the Jewish scriptures very well, maybe they'd lost sight of this one. This is in Psalm 103. This is verses 8 through 13. It says, "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor his anger forever. He does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us. As a father, he has compassion on his children. So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him." The Pharisees are walking around the way we do sometimes. Judgmental, self-righteous, and condemning, even if it's just in our hearts, where we're looking at others and saying, you don't meet my metrics of value. And they believe that that is how God wanted them to be. But unlike the Pharisees, the Psalm tells us God is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with abundant love, forgiving and compassionate. Jesus knew the Pharisees needed this reminder, but I think he knew the Pharisees weren't alone in needing that reminder. You and I need that reminder too. Like that woman with the lost coin, Jesus values you. And he also values the people that you struggle to value, the people that don't meet your metrics. So what about you? How is this parable challenging to you today? How do you need to adjust your understanding of how you might value yourself and how you might value others? So a couple of things to consider. Do you need to let God find you? Because what we see here is that he's always searching for us. Just like the woman in the story today, God is relentlessly chasing after us, even when we wander away from Jesus. If you've wandered away from following Jesus, maybe today's the day that you decide to let yourself be found. And if that's you, maybe your next step is to tell God that you're going to turn away from the wandering and start following Jesus. Do you ever feel like your worth is diminished, and you ever question that maybe you don't have the value that you think you do? Do you question your worth? Are you maybe calculating your worth on the wrong metrics and forgetting that God already says you have worth? If so, maybe today your next step is to ask God and the people that you trust to remind you of your worth. That you don't have to chase after any sort of metric or try to be something that you're not, to try to earn value. That you have value exactly as you are right now because you are God's child. Another thing to consider is, have you ever treated people like they're worthless? Is there anybody that in your heart right now, they have diminished value? And maybe we need to think a little bit differently about how we're treating those people, even if it's the way we're thinking about them. Remember, Jesus told this story to the Pharisees specifically. And although this story does show us how much you and I are valued by God, Jesus doesn't want us to stop there. He has a bigger purpose in telling us this story. It's to challenge us that if we've treated others as if they have lower value, we need to rethink our metrics. We need to rethink the way that we're treating them. So, who have you been viewing as if they're less valuable than you, or less valuable in general? Here's a hint. If you're like, I can't think of anyone. If there is a person or a group of people that you can easily recycle thoughts or reasons in your head about why they are less than you, or why they're problematic or bad, it's them. That's who you're struggling to love. And so, because sometimes we're just crafting in our head why that group of people or why that person is not enough. So maybe your step today is to actively show that group of people or that person that they matter, or to challenge those thoughts, to think something different, to remind yourself that they are God's kid just as much as you are. You haven't done anything to earn God's love. I haven't done anything to earn God's love. But you are loved because you already have value without achieving and earning. Now let that love change you so deeply that you begin to value others the way that God values you. And that's what Jesus challenges us to do, to love others as we love ourselves. So to be reminded of how much you have value and then extend that to other people. Just like the woman in this lost coin, Jesus values you and everyone else so much more than you could possibly know.